So I want to start by thanking you all for being here for our first Beyond the Plays talk of the season. I'm a little emotional because it's been so long.
Yes.
And we've been waiting so long to welcome you back. I wish we were all sitting in John's place on this gorgeous day in Spring Green. But what this medium offers us is that we're able to talk to Khalid from his home in Chicago because he would be too busy to be with us in person today. So welcome back. Welcome back. We are opening a play up the hill tonight. James DeVita's An Improbable Fiction, which is a beautiful new play born in COVID that is blooming and growing up the hill right now. So if you're able to come to see that, please do. And also, we're almost entirely sold out for the Mountaintop. But we do have a gorgeous, Khalid and I were just discussing it. We partnered with HMS Video in Chicago, and they captured a beautiful performance. It is not a film. It is a captured live performance. It feels very much like being up at the Touchstone. So if you're able to see that, you can buy tickets on our website. It is streaming now through the closing of the show. And we'll do that also for all the rest of our plays this season. So those of you who aren't able to get tickets or aren't able to come here or don't feel comfortable being in groups yet, depending on what your comfort level is, we are using social distancing in all of our seating for now until those CDC rules change. But you can see those things on video. And I just want to say one more thing. Jackie Singleton is making all this happen technically. And if you've been with us through any of our streaming, Zooming craziness this year, none of that would have been possible without Jackie. So I want to thank her so much for being with us this morning. Why we're here. We're here to do our Beyond the Plays talk on Katori Hall's The Mountaintop. And I'm thrilled to have with me again, Khalid Y. Long, PhD, doctor, to talk to us today. And if you were here earlier, this is Khalid's third conversation with you all. He came first to discuss Blood Knot as part of that panel in 2018, and 2019 came back to share his expertise on August Wilson. So I'm going to go away from this camera and read because there's a lot of things I want to share about your work, Khalid. So welcome, Khalid Y. Long, PhD, recipient of the Excellence in Teaching Award in 2020, runner-up for the inaugural Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Teaching Activism Award in 2021. He is an assistant professor of theater, coordinator of theater studies, and coordinator of dramaturgy at Columbia College, Chicago. Lucky Columbia. He teaches American drama, theater history, African American performance, and performance studies. His work examines the intersections of race, class, gender, and sexuality within marginalized and oppressed communities. Khalid has published in, or has forthcoming essays in, several scholarly periodicals. Khalid is a freelance dramaturg. His dramaturgical credits include Restless by Tyla Abercrombie. We've done a reading of one of her plays here. She's extraordinary. Native Son by Nami Kelly. Sunset Baby by Dominique Morisseau. Octavia's Brood, Riding the Ox Home by M.K. Abadou. Milk Like Sugar by Kirsten Greenidge. Intimate Apparel by Lynn Nottage. Twilight, Los Angeles, 1992 by Anna Devere, I asked you this.
Devere.
Anna Devere Smith. It's a brilliant play. And Kill Move Paradise by James Iams. That's an extensive resume. We're delighted to have you with us. And so that the audience can just focus on you, I'm going to put myself off camera till we get to the Q&A.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you. And welcome everyone. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm actually going to go ahead and get started. And what I have today is a slideshow presentation that will run with some images as I deliver this talk. And of course, once that's over, I will come back and we'll stop the slideshow and then we'll get started. I just figured we would look at some gorgeous photos of Dr. King and his wife, Coretta Scott King, and also a photo of Katori Hall that sort of depicts what it is that we're going to be talking about today for our talk. And I'm also working from two laptops. So if you see me going back and forth, my talk is on one laptop. And of course, the Zoom camera is on the other. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I think I need to share my screen. And here we are. And I think that should loop. Okay. So good morning, and thank you for joining me today. Before I begin, I'd like to thank American Players Theater, especially Brenda DeVita, Carey Cannon, Sarah Young, and Jackie Singleton, for the invitation to join you all today. Since my first time at American Players Theater in 2018, I've fallen in love with the community, so much so that I often include the company's history and use their approach to theater as a model for my dramaturgy class. In fact, this past semester, for their midterm assignment, students were charged with developing a season for a theater company. American Players Theater was one of the choices. 2 students selected APT, and for one student, the season's theme was, Is This Home? The plays she selected for the season included A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare, A Doll's House Part 2 by Lucas Knaff, The Piano Lesson by August Wilson, Eliot, A Soldier's Fugue by Quera Alegria Hudes, and The Book of Will by Lauren Gunderson. A pretty impressive season, I would say. So Brenda, if you're out there listening today, I hope my students did right by you all. Thank you all for having me back. So I begin this talk today with a quote from Vern E. Smith and John Meacham's essay entitled, The War Over King's Legacy. On Thursday, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. had retreated to room 306 of the Lorraine Motel, worrying about a sanitation strike in Memphis and working on his sermon for Sunday. Its title, Why America May Go to Hell. For King, whose focus had shifted from civil rights to anti-war agitation and populist economics, the dream was turning dark. He had been depressed, sleeping little, and suffering from migraines. In Washington, his plans for a massive Poor People's Campaign were in disarray. In Memphis, King's first march with striking garbage men had degenerated into riot when young Black radicals, not as in the glory days, angry state troopers, broke King's nonviolent ranks. By 5 p.m., he was hungry and looked forward to a soul food supper. Katori Hall's The Mountaintop picks up right at this moment. A play that dramatizes a fictional account of the night before King's murder on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, Hall gives her audience an inside look, perhaps an internal look within King's soul as a way to humanize the man that history has mythologized. When asked about her play, Hall expressed the following: I tried very much to imagine him as a human, not a god. This is the uber American hero, a Christ-like figure to some. But I was searching for the king, warts and all. As Michael Eric Dyson said in his recent book, April 4th, 1968, that's the title of the book, the wish to worship him into perfection is misled. The desire to deify him tragically misplaced. The scars of his humanity are what makes his achievements all the more remarkable. It lets us off the hook to deify him. There is greatness in all of us. We can all carry on his dream. Hall continues, but as a playwright, I just had to imagine, what would a human being do in those given circumstances? This was a man whose life was constantly under fire, quite literally. His house had been bombed. He had already been stabbed. He knew he was a marked man. He always talked about his pending death, even joked about it sometimes with his advisors. A lot of people are not privy to this, but King was quite depressed those last few months of his life. He had taken up smoking to deal with the mounting stress and responsibilities of leading a movement. The given circumstances of his life at that time provided Hall with a rich material to create an entire man. Not the I have a dream man, Hall declares, but a man dealing with depression, dissension in his organization, and pending death. At this point, I should tell you all that I do not plan to talk at length about Mountaintop specifically. To state the obvious, I do not want to give too much away for those who've yet to see the show. But I will share, I've seen APT's production, and I must say, Gavin Lawrence has been performing for such a lengthy period, and he gets better with every new show. Congratulations to all involved. And though I won't give away too much of the Mountaintop story, But as I move forward, it's important to note that Katori Hall's Mountaintop was a hit when it premiered in London at Theatre 503, eventually being transferred to Trafalgar Studios in the West End. Hall won an Olivier Award for Best New Play, which in the West End is synonymous with a Tony Award. The Mountaintop moved on to Broadway in New York, opening at the Bernard Jacobs Theater in 2011, directed by Kenny Leon with a stellar cast whom we normally would see on the big screen. Samuel L. Jackson as Dr. King and Angela Bassett as Kamei. Interesting to note, however, the Mountaintop was not received by mainstream theater officials in America the way it was received in the West End. In other words, the Mountaintop did not garner any Tony Award nominations. Theater scholar Phaedra Chittard Carpenter states that for Hall, this response was not surprising. It actually spoke to the very impulse and exploration that drives her play. In Mountaintop, Dr. King is presented as all too human rather than a sanctified figure upon a staged pedestal. Katori Hall said it herself. She wanted the play to open in England first because the British are used to cracking open the masks of their kings. I mean, side note, let's just think about this. I think we're all waiting for the next season of The Crown, one of my favorite shows. Hall further expresses, if you want to play with the king on a pedestal, there is a play for you over there. If you want a sanitized version of Black women, there is a play over there. I can't please everybody. While the imperfect portrayal of King may be discomforting for some, notes Carpenter, it is exactly what Hall was hoping to portray. What Carpenter is getting to is the notion that too often we have created sanitized versions of some of the most revered people throughout history, that is across time and space. And we learn of something that makes them real, human, or perhaps the real word choice here is flawed. Many of us do not know what to do. In essence, it destroys the fictitious idea of who that person was and in many ways decrease the impacts they've made on our lives. But there's another way to think about that, especially through the lens of Hall's depiction of King. What Katori Hall has given us with her version of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and allow me to repeat that, her version of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a man who was not only flawed, that is imperfect and just as human as any of us today, but whose human qualities, that is the abilities to see, feel, taste, hear, and as we learn in the play, the capacity to allow fear to be at the forefront of our daily experiences informs how we navigate the world. In other words, his humanness is what drove his passion for a better world, for his family, for him, his race, and essentially in the Kingian sense, the human race. Katori Hall's inspiration for writing Mountaintop is directly related to her mother. As the story goes, Hall's mother wanted to attend Dr. King's service at the Mason Temple in Memphis in 1968, but the bomb threats were too severe, and so she decided to stay away. In her own words, Hall recounts, she had never heard him speak, only saw a glimpse of his head in that unfortunate march just 1 week before. When she asked her mother for permission to go, Big Mama said, quote, "You know they're going to bomb that church. Them folks is out to get them." My mother, Katori recounts, Kamei decided that she would stay at home. There was a storm warning. Tornadoes killed 7 people that night, and the rain was relentless. It seemed like God knew, my mother said, and so did King. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. The next day at 6:01 p.m., King was felled by a single bullet on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. Hall states, when my mom told me that story, I thought, if my mother was afraid to go to the church, then Dr. King must have been really afraid to go to the church. Hall states that her mother regretted not attending the service, and so Kamei's character is inspired by her mother. It was a way to put my mother in the room with King because I knew she didn't get a chance on April 3rd, 1968, she says. Katori Hall grew up in a family that was deeply engaged as a community. In fact, she and her siblings, along with her parents, would stage plays in the living room of their family home. It's safe to say then that theater was in the blood. According to one account, her mother was also skilled at storytelling. Hall and four older sisters would gather around the table after the news and listen to their parents recount their day. What the boss man said that day or did or didn't do, Hall states. My parents would inhabit these people's voices. It was like watching one person's shows at the kitchen table. Hall was exposed to the arts quite early due to a program in elementary school for students who displayed intellectual talents early. Bi-monthly, the school would take students on a field trip. It was during one of those field trips where Hall, at the age of 10, would see a production of The Lion, The Witch, and The Wardrobe. Hall went on to serve as the valedictorian of her high school graduation, thus a symbolic act that would usher her into her time at Columbia University, where she'd secured a full scholarship. It was during an acting class, however, where her perception about theater changed. Hall was enrolled in an acting class, and the professor instructed students to research scenes with characters with whom they may have identified. For Hall and her scene partner, another Black woman, this meant a scene with two Black women. They embarked on the assignment, but their efforts were to no avail. Hall expresses, when we came back to the theater, we said, the Columbia Library does not have a play with two Black women. And the teacher was no help either, as she couldn't think of a play for the pair. In that moment, Hall thought to herself, I'm going to have to write those plays then. Upon graduating from Columbia, Hall went on to Harvard University's American Repertory Theater to continue her studies in theater. She graduated and began taking small roles in New York. Some of you may have seen her on early episodes of Law and Order. She would also take a job at XM Radio, where she would meet the likes of Oprah Winfrey, Jay-Z, and Beyonce. And then she earned a place in Juilliard School to develop her talent as a playwright. It was her play, Who Do Love, that earned her a spot in the program, where she was mentored by playwrights Marcia Norman and Christopher Durang. The play is about a woman who escapes the cotton fields of Mississippi and travels to Memphis to pursue a dream of singing the blues. Who Do Love was produced in 2007, and it was in that same year where she began to write The Mountaintop. When asked about the play, Hall shared, because the story was told to me so many times in my life in a weird way, I've been writing it my whole life. I'm a story collector. I hear a story and I keep it in my personal arsenal. It will work on itself in me until it needs to leap out onto the page. Early 2007 was when I decided that I was going to put this story to paper. I wrote the first 8 pages then and didn't touch it till fall. Hall continues and shared that it was partly that the 40-year marker of Dr. King's assassination was coming up. And around the same time, America was preparing for the arrival of its first Black president, Barack Obama. At that moment in my life, in America's history, Hall shares, I was putting a lot of things together and questioning how far we had come as a nation since King's death and how much we still needed to do. The moment of the anniversary prompted her to finally sit down at the computer and write that story. Before closing, I want to discuss Hall's place in American theater, more specifically, what she may see as her role within the African-American dramatic tradition. For some time now, I've been interested with the ways in which contemporary Black playwrights use the stage as a space to recover and recuperate history, subsequently illuminating communities that were otherwise unknown. For instance, I think of Pearl Clegg, August Wilson, Lynn Nottage, and Dominique Morisseau. Precisely, these playwrights have penned dramas that are transformative historical revisions that serve to impact the collective African-American national memory. And in doing so, they have evidenced that performance can serve as a methodology for revisionist history and reconstructive reparative historiography. Drawing upon historical events or periods as backdrops for her plays, the aim of these playwrights, including Hall, however, is not to restage history, but rather to probe the significance of African-American history across space and time. In other words, they ask their audience to consider how the past influences the present. Accordingly, Hall is cognizant that her plays follow in the tradition of socially active and politically aware theater. Indeed, her works have the potential to teach, especially through its engagement with historical agents. In her essay, Feminist Performance and Feminist Historiography, theater historian Charlotte Cannon writes, "The performance of history is not usually held up as a legitimate mode of historiography. The profession that excluded women also excluded myriad historiographical modes, generally narrowing them to the lecture, the article, and the book. Performance, then, is often relegated to or categorized in another form. History plays, autobiography, or community theater, for example, and as such, understood to fill other functions than historiographical treatments of the past. While Katori Hall's plays, especially Mountaintop, should not be taken wholly as history plays, one is cognizant of how Hall recontextualizes the role of major figure as well as everyday people during historic periods within African-American history through performance. In other words, one recognizes how Hall stages Black people's subjectivity, thus demonstrating aspects of and ideas about history that are less possible in print. Whereas her plays are built around actual material circumstances from the past, Hall plays in, off, and with history. This is a dramaturgical trait most noticed in the plays of August Wilson. Like Wilson, Hall concedes that history, as currently constituted, reflects a bias that is not in her interest. And so, functioning in her own self-interest, she makes some up. She acts, if you will, or in this case, she writes her own history. In that, Hall has embraced what theater scholar Harry Elam calls an imaginative archaeology, where one endeavors not only to uncover the past, but also actually participate in its construction in the present. If performance becomes a subversive strategy, acting as a form of historical resistance to the omission of the Black presence, then one could surmise that Hall follows in the footsteps of August Wilson, Susan Laurie Parks, and Lynn Nottage, to name a few. That is, she takes up the role as a type of dramatic and theatrical historian, conjuring up spirits and stories to be documented through performance as opposed to being omitted from the written text. Finally, I'm going to leave you all with something to ponder, which I think was Katori Hall's aim with the closing of her play, The Mountaintop. At the end of the play, we hear Dr. King revel in the notion of no more. He states, no more, the promised land here on earth. The no more that King was referring to was an implication that in the future, more specifically, the materialization of his dreams, there would be no more poverty, no more acts of bigotry, no more police violence, no more wars, and the list goes on. No more, no more, no more. But if we really sit and think about where America is now, and the greater world for that matter, King was right about one thing. The promised land is so close, but yet so far away. Thank you. And I think now I'm going to stop share as we are sort of at the end of the formal presentation. So I'll stop sharing here. And
thank you. Thank you so much, Khalid. I have so many questions myself and so many little, like, I feel like there's 7 conversations to have about the things that you shared. Okay. I want to encourage those participants who are able to be with us. You can type in your questions in the Q&A and our wonderful Jackie Singleton will be able to share them with us. But before any of those come up, I'm so struck by how you ended. I mean, I have a lot of questions, but the idea of imaginative archaeology is such a rich idea, rich statement. But I also, we have APT has just begun with Gavin Lawrence, who I share with you my reverence of his extraordinary talents,
right.
His interest in sharing voices, new voices with our audience. So we have a video, which is going to end up being a podcast as well, called In the Wake of Our Shadow, Black Voices. Mm-hmm. And he has interviewed so far Amy Kwan Barry, who's a wonderful novelist and playwright and poet, and also Carlisle Brown, who is a playwright who we've produced. His African Company Presents Richard III, and also Are You Now or Have You Ever Been? And that conversation, which is great and available if you want to listen to it, hearing Carlisle Brown talk about how many of his plays focus on historical events,
right,
and him talking about, but that's not the history I was taught.
Right.
I had to excavate. So when you said imaginative archaeology, it reminded me so clearly of that conversation with Carlisle Brown about, I've got to create the world that I want to see.
Right. Right. Well, it's interesting. So I should also note that. So I did watch Gavin's discussion with Carlisle Brown. I did. I'm a big fan of Carlisle Brown's. When I was in my master's program at Miami University of Ohio, back in 2000, oh God, it was like 2005, 2006 or something around that time. Miami's theater department, we commissioned Carlisle Brown to write a play, and I forgot the title of it, to sort of in conjunction with Mississippi Summer, anniversary of Mississippi Summer, Freedom Summer, where Miami University's, a portion of the campus in Ohio, Oxford, Ohio, was a training ground for Freedom Summer. And so, of course, you think about Fannie Lou Hamer and the pioneers there, and Carlisle Brown wrote a play. Oh, I think the play entitled Mississippi Summer. I think the play was entitled Mississippi Summer. And so, I was not a direct participant on that project, but I was around and sort of was a part of some of the discussions and so forth. But in the larger scheme here, I think, so what Carlisle Brown and ultimately Katori Hall and so many other playwrights are getting to is the idea that, again, they're missing, their stories, their narratives are missing from conventional records, right? Mm-hmm. And when I say conventional, I'm talking about, accounts that we consider to be, history, right? The ways in which we write history and tell history, who gets to be included, whose narrative gets to be told, and more emphatically, whose lens do we view those moments, those stories, those narratives, and what Katori Hall though does much more, and I didn't go into this too much into the play. One of the things that make Katori Hall such a significant playwright is because most of her stories take place in Memphis. Mm-hmm. In a similar sense, what August Wilson did with the Pittsburgh cycle, mm-hmm. And also what even Terrell Alvin McCraney is doing with his plays, right? Mm-hmm. Where his plays take place often in this fictitious area in Louisiana, I think San mm-hmm. Perry, Louisiana, right? But in many ways, just to note, Terrell Alvin McCraney is sort of modeling that area after the area from Miami, Florida.
From Miami, right.
Black populated area in Miami, Florida, right? And so what they're doing as a collective and putting Hall at the center, obviously, for today's talk, is not only are they putting Black stories on the stage, because those stories are often missing from the historical record, but they're focusing in, right, on like recognized or Black communities like mm-hmm. Memphis, these communities like small town in Memphis, Tennessee, Pittsburgh, mm-hmm. Pennsylvania, or as with McCraney, right? This mm-hmm. very, very underserved area in Miami, Florida, right? Mm-hmm. These Black communities that oftentimes, particularly when we think about American politics and resources and education, mm-hmm. they're underserved, mm-hmm. right? And by putting those folks on the stage, what they're saying is, right, is that these people matter, their stories matter, and if you actually sit down and listen to them, you'll learn like how their individual narratives are connected to sort of the greater things that have happened throughout history, vis-a-vis Martin Luther King, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's so, I mean, thinking about those communities, right? Particularly those playwrights. We often say here, as specific as we're able to get, as those playwrights are able to get, because of their intimate knowledge of the humanity of those groups of people, which is connected to place, so connected to place.
Yes.
And then, reading Isabel Wilkerson, The Warmth of Other Suns, like talking about what it is to move that kind of migration and how those stories shifted through the country. Yes. But that specificity allows us, and, at APT, we have a largely white audience, to be able to look, to understand based on all of that knowledge Katori Hall brings to the character of Carey, who is the Memphis native, who is able to, through the play, share the very specifics of her story, and allow us, because of the specifics of it, to identify in a way that we're able to with August Wilson. We can say, I see my dad. Yes. Because it's so clear, it's so real, it's so nuanced.
Yes.
We, as opposed to feeling othered by it, feel invited because of the authenticity of those voices. Yes. We recognize, we hear, we see that humanity.
Right. It's interesting. I read something the other day and I cannot remember what it was. I feel like, it's funny because I actually keep little books like this with me because I read so much sometimes. And I always want to refer back. And so I'm like, let me note this down really quickly. Or I'll send myself a quick email through my phone. Look at this later. I have lots of emails like that. And so I read something recently that talked about how Black playwrights, even after thinking about the tradition of African-American playwrights, even though many of their plays are specific within the context of race, right? So they're writing about Black people, what actually makes their work so, for lack of a better term, universal to some degree, and that's a tricky term, right? But I'm using it today. Yeah. Is that because even though they're talking about race, their stories are inherently universal because regardless of how one identifies, they see themselves, right, connected to some degree. This goes back to Lorraine Hansberry. Many, many folks in American theater were like, oh, I relate to this story. Because if we not necessarily look at the racial aspect, but the father-son relationship, the mother and daughter relationship, the husband and wife relationship, right? The struggle to attain, if you will, the American dream, whatever that means to you, right? The attainment, the goal to just survive a world that is tragic around you, right? If we think about women, right, in all these plays, thinking about how women are attempting to survive and thrive in a very patriarchal world, right? So these stories, in many ways, they become, while they're very specific and they're very narrowed in scope, they ultimately have a sort of a global or rather, should I say, a national framework that allows anybody to come in and see themselves on the stage, or at the very least, have empathy, right, for the characters, because they may not be familiar with those specific characters, but they're familiar with the stories at large to some degree, right? Yeah.
There's so many stories we want to tell for our audience. We're so excited to share stories. That's our gig, right? That's what we do. And so reading stories and getting excited about getting a team together to bring them to life when we're talking about stories that we can tell in theater, as opposed to, we love films and we love to read books, but here's how you put a team together to tell a story. And what I love, I'm thinking about the authenticity and specificity of those stories, is that on this particular show, we had a new voice and text coach, Jacqueline Springfield, who's brilliant. We're so excited to begin that relationship, but she's from Memphis. Yeah. And so and we couldn't have, you can't cast like that all the time, but her presence there with Ron O.J. Parson as the director, and Shola Thompson and Gavin, they were able to lean into her experience. Of having been in that place, having that sound in her ear, having the rhythms of that community very authentically connected to her. Right. And we're, excited talking about expanding the stories we're able to tell, continuing to bring August Wilson's stories to our audience, and Terrell Alvin McCraney. Next season, we're going to get to finally produce Brother Size, which is
Wonderful.
Yeah. I mean, it's a masterpiece, and it's deeply poetic.
Yes.
And connected, as you said, I'm glad you said, to place. And although it's in Louisiana, it is, as if anybody who saw the brilliant movie Moonlight can see how connected he is. And as Gavin, when we were auditioning for that play, being in the room with Gavin and Gavin talking about, no, this is a play where we get to see the deep love, the deep connection between these Black men. This is not something we see enough, certainly on stage or in our entertainment world, but so we're not continuing to only tell stories of suffering. We are telling stories of love. We're telling stories of connection. We're telling stories of humor, of humanity. And as Katori Hall insisted in this play, that we are seeing human beings, warts and all, but that is their connections as families, as lovers, as fathers, as mothers. So every time I read a new play and I think, oh, I can't wait to tell this story to our audience. They're going to love this story.
I do the same thing often. I read plays and I'm like, oh, I got to teach this. And then I find myself, at the top of the semester with 30 plays, but only 15 weeks. And so I'm like, how do we figure this out, right? And obviously I have to pare it down sometimes. But I want to mention that, in thinking about Katori Hall and also Terrell Lowry McCraney, I want to mention a book that I recently reviewed for a theater journal, a new book called After August by Patrick Maley, M-A-L-E-Y. And Patrick Maley is sort of chronicling August Wilson's blues methodology, which I think is really germane to both Katori Hall and Terrell McCraney's work. But in his last chapter, he makes this argument that August Wilson is sort of a forefather of and for contemporary, particularly American playwrights, but African-American playwrights specifically. And he makes his argument that Katori Hall and Terrell McCraney, like we're talking about them, that they are actually sort of the predecessors of Wilson's legacy. But not only do they follow in his legacy and, write about Black folks within these very marginalized and historically oppressed communities, but also, still having finding that ability to thrive, right? Sort of embodying the notion that we say Black joy, thriving even in the midst of oppression. He makes his argument that though, like McCraney, for instance, pushes Wilson's framework and methodology by writing stories specifically about young Black queer men and boys, right? And I always find that interesting. It is interesting to make sure we decipher the two, boys and men. I remember a couple years ago, I was dramaturging the show Kirsten Greenwich's Milk Like Sugar, directed by the fabulous Jennifer Nelson, down at Mosaic Theater in DC. And this is back when I was living down there. And I remember she made a talk, like opening night, we did a talk. And she said, this play is about young girls, not women. And I thought that was so important. And ever since then, I've been making that distinction. So
right.
Like boys, girls, men, women. There's a difference, right? Because oftentimes we hear, think about Raisin. We know about Walter. We know about, Beneatha. We know about Mama and Ruth. But Travis was a boy. Right. His experience was very different from the other characters. But anyway, back to my point. So Patrick Maley makes the point that Katori Hall, like McCraney, pushes Wilson's, framework and his methodology, but her works center women in many ways. And so let's talk about that. I know we're, time is almost up.
I'm just saying, because you have another talk to give in 12 minutes.
In 12 minutes, but I gotta just say this, right? Because I didn't talk about this too much in my talk today, but because I didn't want to take up too much time. But, King is at the center of this piece to some degree, but Kamei is as well, right? This woman who, as we learn, I don't want to give it away, but we learn is sort of this mystic figure following in Wilson's footsteps, right?
Right.
Figure. And in many ways, her presence and the way that she delivers that really heavy hitting speech in the middle of the play, when she's the audience, you'll get to see it. That right there is sort of an acknowledgement of women's roles, particularly the role that Black men played in the development of the civil rights that era, that period, and their mindset, their thinking. Because remember, he says to her, "Well, what would you say?" And she comes up with this speech, right? That is the role of Black women. But also, I don't want to give too much away, but the telephone, like the person she speaks to on the phone and who she references, Black, she says, well, no, she's a woman, right? That is Katori Hall's way of sort of reframing our like hetero patriarchal mindset about these mystical figures that for so long we've thought about as men. But what about if we shift that narrative, that paradigm, and think about them in the context of being women? Right. And I think so. Hall is really on to something deep here. Right. And it's very kind of, but she doesn't do it in this kind of like strict realism. Right. She does it in a mystical way that in essence, it moves beyond perhaps what it is that we can imagine. And we only can, therefore, as August Wilson said, you only can imagine this in this kind of, spiritual sense. So, and I'll leave it at that. But I
love that. Thank you to leave it at that. And I feel like that Katori Hall leaves us with what King leaves us with, which is, to create a world where these stories continue to be told. Like, who is picking up the baton? Who is telling the story next? And that our responsibility in that, we'll watch the story, but what is our, what do we, so I'm grateful. I'm grateful to Katori Hall for this play. I'm grateful, Khalid, for your time.
Thank you.
I hope you can come out and see a play this summer. We're going to
that is my goal. Actually, my goal is actually to come out now that we're back open and just to because I love Spring Green, just to come and have some fabulous dinner and see a show and just kind of chill out for a little bit. Yes.
Great. I would love that. Please let me know. And thank you for your time. Thank you all of you for coming and listening to this conversation with us. I'm excited to have more of them. And have a beautiful day. Grateful. Thank you, Khalid.
I'll see you soon.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.